Good evening, my name is Maggie Leek, and I'm here with my co-host, Amanda, who's awesome in the blue wig. And today we're going to talk about Shigeru Mizuki. So most of you probably are like, who the hell is Shigeru Mizuki, and why should I give a crap ends to care about him? Well, do you like monster comics? Do you like stuff that deals with the monsters in the manga? Or do you like alternative stuff? Then you like Shigeru Mizuki. In Japan, he is probably considered one of the great manga artists of the late 50s and 60s period generation. To the point where they have trains that have his characters on them in Japan, and his hometown, there is a museum and a street honoring him. So the question you gotta ask yourself then, I'm guessing, is, why should I care? Well, like I said, he's most famous for his monsters works in the area of Europe. So his first work that he's most famous for is called Kitaro, and it's basically Kitaro comes from the ancient Japanese tradition. So back in the early days, people in Japan would put these wooden platforms on bikes, roll into town, and then show different pictures and tell different stories for the children. And it was also a way of getting news. It was kind of a pre-TV day. Anyways, one of the characters from that series of slides and stories they were telling was Kitaro. So Shigeru Mizuki decided to make him into his main character in his story, and has created a massive amount of stories based around him, based around the Yuri. So what a Yuri is, in America we have these conceptualizations of spirits, monsters, nymphs, and things of that nature. In Japan they call those Yuri. The Koopa would probably be the best example in video gaming if you're looking for what a Yuri is. But anyways, some Yuri are good, some are bad, some are just downright mischievous. And they're a very spiritual thing, and it's very heavily tied to the Shinto traditions. So Kitaro is basically a Yuri living in what was modern Japan of the 1960s at that point, and he is fighting with against the other Yuri, protecting the humans. And this is the stories of his mass adventures. And what makes this an incredible work is, if you look at the artwork on it, is just the massive collection of his stories. For example, the first book we're going to talk about is Kitaro. So this was the first collection put out by Drawn Quarterly of his works. And in this he collected the greatest hits, basically, of Kitaro's stories, including the Great Yokai War. So basically, his most famous story is called the Great Yokai War, when the Yokis all go to war and kill each other. And this did fairly well, so Drawn Quarterly picked up the next set of licenses and are slowly releasing the Ultimate Kitaro collection, starting with the birth of Kitaro, which tells how he was born. Basically, he was born out of his dad, and how the eyeball. So one thing that makes Kitaro unique is you always see this picture of him with this weird eyeball-like thing right here. That's his dad. The other thing about Kitaro is he's missing his eye. So he will always have his hair over his missing eye, and his dad usually travels either on top of his head or in his eye. And there's other Yuri characters that appear through and out, some good, some evil, including the girl eating stealer. And so they're now collecting all these into these wonderful works. And in a few minutes, I'll let you guys take a look at them. But like I said, definitely worth reading if you're into the early origins of monster comics in Japan. Not so much Godzilla, but more like all the spiritual monster stuff, the stuff that inspired things like Avatar: The Last Airbender. I mean, who here has seen the Avatar: The Last Airbenders? Yeah. You remember all the heavy, and then the heavy ones when they did the spiritual stuff? Those are kind of what these creatures are in this book. So if you're heavily into the spiritual side, or into just seeing mischievous demons causing trouble, this is one. And also, Yuri, you gotta remember, even in our favorite game, Super Mario Brothers, the Koopas are based on a Yuri character called the Koopa. It has a little bowl on its head with water in it, and if you knock the bowl off, the Koopa dies. Jumping on its head to knock the water out and kill it in Mario's. So, these are what he's known primarily for. This series, they've got 2 more announced for this year so far, and they've only put out 2 so far in his collection, and there's more coming. There's going to be probably about 10 in the collection. I picked them up for at half price for $7, but they sell for about $14, $15, $10 to $15. This one's a $25 book, but it's worth it. It's his greatest hits. So in these books, they asked Shigeru Mizuki, what is the one book that every one of his fans should read? And then he wanted to see the most translated to English. And his answer was, no, ba, which is this one right here. So this is where his work gets more personal. So Shigeru Mizuki started writing his autobiography, and he's telling it in a dozen different stories. This is the one that focuses on his childhood. So in this book, it starts off with him being like a young, about 5-6-year-old child, and we meet his grandma. We meet then it's basically his kind of pseudo grandmother. You know, I don't know. I'm assuming everyone here had grandparents at one point in their life. But I didn't. My grandmother and grandfather didn't survive the war, so I had surrogate grandparents, and that's why I kind of like this book really came on personal, because she, in this book, you can take it around. In this book, she is one of the main. She's like, it's mainly her stories with him, and basically it tells the story of his journey and his spiritual discovery. Because Nana was very spiritual. She would stop and pray. She knew all the rituals and customs to prevent evil spirits coming on this earth. And so she took him on a journey through different adventures. And it tells the story. It also introduces all his brothers and his mom and his dad and several other children that run around in the neighborhood. And it's a very like, how would I explain it? The book has a lot of like very sad, tragic moments in it, but it also has a lot of happy moments. And it does deal with a lot of the more adult issues. For example, one of the characters is sold off into slavery at the end. And there is one character who can basically see the spirits and is in touch and actually talk, and there's a scene where you see her talking with one of the Yuri. The big scary Yuri in the city, in that town. And it's a romantic childhood story of childhood. In other words, there's bullying in it, kids getting the crap beat out of each other, all the other sort of stuff that comes with childhood. But it sets up and establishes where he got his spiritualism from and how he became that. So the next series of books, which I only have 2 of them sadly, were the history of Japan. It was his 4-volume history of Japan. So this series starts at the birth of the emperor and ends in the 80s with the death of the emperor. So it starts covering all the historical events in Japan, including World War II, the following end of the war, and the reemergence of Japan in the 80s. But what makes it interesting is, it's not just about him. It's not just about history. I mean, yes, there are historical events they talk about, like, it opens up with the Great Earthquake of 1928, then the stock market crash. But it also intertwines with his personal story. So the characters you were introduced in Onward return in this series of 4 books. You see his dad and mom grow old and die. You see some of his brothers and neighbors die in World War II. You see him fighting in World War II. Which, I don't know if anyone's here ever read a Japanese perspective on World War II, but this is probably one of the more twisted versions of what it was like to serve in World War II. We'll get to that. There's another work that explains it even more, which will be coming up in a second. And this work was it's an amazing history lesson if you want to learn about the history of Japan from the Meiji period. But it's also an amazing work because it's a very personal tale about his family and how they were dealing with the situation at the time. And because they were a rural Japanese family, they were affected a lot differently than the city life. He does go to the city in the later works, but his family stays much rural works. His dad in Onward was introduced as probably one of the laziest people I've ever met in my life. He kept getting fired from simple jobs. He was a college-educated man. I think everyone in this room probably knows someone. You know, really smart, super smart, but lazy as heck. I see you closing your eyes and you're like, yeah, sounds like a friend of mine. I want to just smack him in the head. I have lots of friends like that. We have verboten. Yeah, okay. So that's what makes this book amazing is his dad's lazy and you see his dad going through multiple jobs and getting fired and getting hired and his mom smacking him over the head. And earlier we were talking about the samurai panel. She kept screaming throughout in the history, my family was a samurai, we had a sword. So his family was of note, was a samurai noted family. So as I said, Shigeru Mizuki served in World War II. He was old enough, he was one of the few manga artists from the great era of manga in the 50s and 60s that served in World War II. This is considered, in the Gaikai format, most of these works are considered what are called Gaikai, which is the more adult version of comics. They weren't happy, they aren't the wonderful, everybody loves everything and the universe is great comic book. These were the dark, evil comics. So he decided to write about his war experience. Basically in the back of the book, it will explain to you, he goes, about 80 to 90% of this book is 100% true. The other 20% I made up. And by what he says is made up, everybody dies pretty much in this book. The only people that live are the high command. Every single character dies in this. Shigeru Mizuki obviously didn't die in World War II. He just lost his arm. Details. Because of him losing his arm, actually, he survived the war. But one thing that drove him nuts in the war was just the stupidity and the hopelessness of the war. Of them constantly sending people on death marches for no reason, and the sacrifices they made, the general soldiers make, the lack of food, and well, basically the book can be broken up into three major themes. I get slapped a lot by the sergeant, a lot. And then he goes, does the sergeant have any other thing but slapping? And as the sergeant slaps him and says no. The next chapter is, crap, I'm hungry all the time. So evidently there wasn't much food at this point, so it's them and their misadventures as they go hunting for food. And it doesn't look pretty when they go for hunting for food. Literally in one section, a guy gets killed eating a fish that he caught. He's so hungry, he just swallows the fish whole and chokes to death. It's death by sushi. And it's done in a quite, this is where it makes it kind of Gaikai. You're laughing at a guy dying choking on a fish. Anyways, and the book then takes a tragic turn as the military decides to put them on a hopeless defense of this island and sending them back into a guerrilla warfare. And so they head into basically a hopeless charge. The Americans cut off their water, manage to capture the lake that gives them their fresh water supply, and they head off into basically fighting, struggling to survive. They have to hunt for water, they have to hunt for everything, and slowly they die. And then in the end, it ends in a tragic charge, and it's basically just a really sad book. And okay, so we're on my last book, and then you guys, I'd love if y'all can come up here and take a look at all these. There's two over there. But the last book, and this is the book that I love. When I set up these panels, I didn't expect to write to talk about Hitler at all in any of my panels. And now I've managed to talk about Hitler in 2 of my panels. It's the Biography of Hitler. God, I don't know who could propose a panel saying, let's have a panel about Hitler, but I did. And you know what? When I first saw this book, I was like, are you effing kidding me? And actually, it's really good. I couldn't put it down. I read it almost in one sitting. And it was like 1 in the morning when I finished reading it, and I was like, oh my word. The book is very interesting. So for most people, when you read a biography of Hitler, it's about the monstrosity that was Hitler. And it focuses mostly on his war years, maybe a little on his rise, and basically it focuses on all the evil that the devil-possessed creature that he was did. This book, on the other hand, shows the Japanese perspective of Hitler. So the Japanese blamed Hitler for their defeat in a lot of ways, because he dragged them into the war with them and forced them to fight with America, even though they had a treaty with Russia, and Russia didn't declare war until the end of the war on them. So this book basically focuses on Hitler, the loser. So it basically, what makes me love about this book is it shows you Hitler as he truly was. Complete and utter douchebag loser. He would be comfortable in a Magic the Gathering tournament. I'm sure everyone here has played in Magic the Gathering tournaments. He was lazy. He was actually a bum at one point and lived as a vagabond in Austria. He was actually a draft dodger, even though in his history he said, oh, he loved serving in the military. No, he dodged the Austrian draft by running to Munich. And basically, Hitler was an opportunist, and he portrays him as a loser opportunist who managed to luck into all of what he had, and how he basically rose to power because of the anti-sentiment of the leftovers from World War I, and the fact that the man could yell like no one's business. Basically, it's very relevant with the Trump era. I'm not going to try to get political. I'm not sure. Hopefully no one here is a Trump supporter. Trump supporters in the room?
No one's going to admit it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's true. Who's going to admit, yes, I love Trump? No, I don't. I think he's a horrible president, and I'm waiting for his impeachment, and I'm dreading what's coming behind him.
Stop.
All right, anyways, let's stop getting political. So this book basically raises his rise and fall, and it focuses mostly on his rise, and it's a good read because if you want to understand how evil came to power and a country got taken over by a complete and utter loser, read this book. And make sure when you see a loser taking over, like we have currently, we need to stop it. So these are the works of Shigeru Mizuki, one of the great manga artists of the 20th century, and thankfully now Drawing Court is putting him out, so we have an opportunity to finally read some of his works. And I'd like to welcome you all up here to take a look at the books, and then as I get set up for the next panel. So come on up.
Oh, so sorry.
Right?